Good afternoon. I'm Trish Hartung, and I'm the Executive Director of the Upper Savannah Council of Governments in Greenwood, South Carolina. I'm happy to be here today as part of NATO's virtual annual conference. I'd like to welcome you all to the session, OMB's revision to 2 CFR 200, what's changed and what you need to do about it. A very timely topic that is critical for all economic development districts as it pertains to the federal funds we receive to manage our programs and provide services. The Office of Management and Budget recently released significant revisions to 2 CFR 200, or Cost Principles and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. These revisions will be effective in a few weeks on November 12th. In addition, OMB rolled out the 2020 version of its compliance supplement, the audit guide that independent auditors must use when they conduct your annual single audit. This session will cover the things that you need to know about these key federal grants management documents and will provide practical advice about how your organization should prepare for their use. I'd like to recognize the Three Rivers Planning Development District in Pontotoc, Mississippi for their generous support of this session and for NATO's 2020 Annual Training Conference. I was thrilled to be asked to moderate this session as I have known Bob for many years. His knowledge and expertise have helped my organization and other COGs in South Carolina, as well as around the country, and he's been a regular trainer at NATO's events. Bob is recognized nationally as the expert in anything related to grants management training. Over the past decade, Bob has shared his expertise and knowledge about all aspects of federal grants management during sessions at NATO's conferences, regional convenings, and during our grants management webinars. If you have any questions for Bob, please type them in the box to the right of the screen, and we will hold questions until the end of the session. And now I'd like to welcome Bob Lloyd.
Well, thanks very much, Trish, for that introduction. And as you know firsthand and from long experience when it comes to dealing with direct federal grants and those that are passed through state agencies, the devil can be in the details, and those details can seriously affect the ability of regional organizations and their member governments to be effective implementers of federal aid programs. On more than a few occasions, and you know about some of those, I've been invited to referee a disagreement between federal or state awarding agency folks and regional development organizations by whatever name they're called. And I'm often troubled to see an awarding agency forgetting that the awards are called federal financial assistance for a good reason, and that adding additional burden is not always the best way to help somebody. So the details that we're going to be talking about here in this session come from the Office of Management and Budget. And that agency, of course, has been busy in the last 7 months, and particularly so since mid-August when, as Trish indicated, the revisions to 2 CFR 200 were rolled out along with the changes to the compliance supplement. And so we're going to discuss what these products involve in terms of policy, and then suggest what steps you should be taking as a result. Now, let's go to the slide deck, and slide number 2 identifies Title 2 of the Code of Federal Regulations. The stuff we're talking about is housed in that particular section, and the Code of Federal Regulations is actually a voluminous set of documents, can fill a full bookshelf top to bottom, 6 feet by 4 feet probably. But Title II has grown up over the past decade or so as the repository of policies related to grants and agreements. And of course, the agreements they're referring to are cooperative agreements and subawards thereunder that are dealt with. Most of the things that are in the early part of Title II were issued by the Office of Management and Budget, which of course is a part of the Executive Office of the President. And OMB views its role as instructing federal agencies on how to deal with various management challenges. But included within Title II are issuances by the federal awarding agencies themselves that are in response to what OMB has issued. So there's kind of a two-tiered approach here. Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements is the official title of 2 CFR 200, and it represents a consolidation and a harmonization of a collection of Office of Management and Budget documents that many of you veterans are probably familiar with. OMB circulars A102 and A87 and A133 have all been superseded and folded into this document. So the requirements have the force and effect of law because they were adopted following the Administrative Procedure Act, which is a policy document that establishes that when federal executive branch agencies want to issue policies that will have the force and effect of law, they must go through formal rulemaking. Well, OMB did that twice in the period between 2012 and 2014, and forced all the federal agencies to adopt on a single day the requirements of 2 CFR 200. That single day was December 26th of 2014. And in adopting the regulation, the agencies gave regulatory effect to it. Now, on slide number 3, I've traced out kind of the history lesson associated with today's program. And I'm certainly not going to dive deep into that, but I feel it's important to document how we got to where we are. And the process really started in 2012. It culminated in 2014. But one very important aspect of that process was that OMB in the regulation made a commitment to conduct a review of the regulation 5 years out from its implementation. And OMB, to a large extent, made good on that promise. In the intervening 5 years, however, a number of things happened. There were some enactments of statutes that affected assistance programs in places that you might not normally think of them, particularly the National Defense Authorization Acts, which are gigantic statutes which obviously deal with the national defense, but because they do, they are kind of requirements that have to be dealt with. It's not something that the federal government can kick the can down the road on. And so some of those things carry with them requirements that we're going to be talking about here. In addition to that, of course, there have been some presidential executive orders. Some of them were issued by Barack Obama. Others were issued by Donald Trump. But because when the president issues an executive order, unless it's inconsistent with statute, it has the force and effect of law as well. Some of the things that we're dealing with here came out of those issuances. Well, again, OMB made good on its promise to review these requirements and issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on January 22nd of this year with a 60-day comment period, which culminated right about the time that we all became familiar with COVID-19. And certainly lots of organizations weighed in on improvements that could be made in the regulation, and that included among those was NADO. Now, something that's also critical in this discussion is that the requirements that we're dealing with were addressed in a number of ways by OMB in the early portion of the pandemic, where they issued a number of memoranda to federal agencies. Those memoranda are numbered according to a sequence that you can see there, 2011, 2017, 2026, and a bunch of others in between, which told federal agencies what to do about the fact that organizations were running into shutdowns and other kinds of calamities that were going to affect the implementation of their federal grant programs. So those things were going on parallel to the consideration of the comments that OMB received from some 215 different organizations. On slide number 4, if we move to the next one, NADO has been a player in all that, and I've been glad to participate in some of its activities associated with it. As you can see from the slide, it has submitted a number of comment letters to OMB about issues that have been identified by member organizations in one way or another. Back in 2019, a comment letter urged OMB to instruct auditors to look at pass-through entities' compliance with payment procedures and issues of burden associated with submission of backup documentation to support financial reports. That particular urging is something that's continued subsequently, and the comment letter that went in on 2 CFR 200 revisited some of those things, as well as dealt with what I think in many areas was a significant issue for development districts, namely the acceptance of indirect cost rates by federal and pass-through awarding agencies. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But just as an example, and I'll refer back to Trish on this one, we engaged in South Carolina for 2 years with the South Carolina Department on Aging about whether or not subrecipients in the aging program, namely area agencies on aging, should be paid in advance rather than paid after they had incurred cost. And ultimately, that matter was settled because of what the regulations actually say. Now, moving over to the next slide, what's the verdict on all this? Well, first off, OMB, I think for perhaps understandable reasons, but nonetheless frustrating reasons to some of the commenters, limited the changes they made in 2 CFR 200 only to the purposes and subjects that they originally proposed. Even though they got extensive comments on other aspects of the regulation, these were deemed, and you can see the quotes, out of scope and were not accepted. And so numerous problems affecting recipients and subrecipients remain. Now, one piece of meat that I think OMB threw to the grantee community is they indicated that they would continue to have consultation with stakeholders and to consider possible additional revisions. And one of the things I'm going to suggest before we're done here is that NADO and its members take them up on that assertion. And clearly, NADO is not going to be alone in all this. There are lots of other affected organizations that have weighed in, and I would point to the college and university community as a very effective lobby, and we'll call it that, as well as the independent auditor community, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, the National State Auditors Association, and so on, are all entities that have concerns about the regulation and have continued to knock on OMB's door and tell them about what they think. Now, the actual revisions that were issued on August 13th address a number of sections of 2 CFR 2 CFR. As you can see, there are a couple of sections, 2 CFR 25 and 170, that we're going to talk about today. Be glad you don't perform agreements overseas. Congress passed a law called Never Contract with the Enemy Act, which is affecting charities that get money from the State Department and from the U.S. Agency for International Development and are operating in many cases, war zones, and have to consider some of the due diligence actions that they have to deal with in that kind of situation. But, thank goodness that's not a situation that NATO members have to confront. Now, as you can see, the regulation was published in the Federal Register on August 13th, but it takes effect in just about 3 weeks on November 12th, except for 2 sections which took effect on publication. So the coverage I want to give to what has happened relate to the 3 sections that are identified at the bottom of the slide. Now, just to give you a little grounding, on slide number 7, what I've listed there is the major sections of the regulation itself. And some of these titles are self-evident, but Subpart C is primarily addressed to the federal agencies, particularly those that are making direct federal awards. And so I know many NATO members get some direct federal funding, and would need to familiarize themselves with what the folks on the other side of the table are being told to do. But the things that really focus in on what recipients and subrecipients have to do is subparts D, E, and F. The post-federal award requirements or administrative requirements in subpart D, the cost principles, which are the rules for determining what costs are allowable, what costs are not allowable, and how the costs are to be documented, and the audit requirements, which is now in subpart F of 2 CFR 200 and replaces the venerable OMB Circular A133, which became common nomenclature in the federal grants community. The appendices to the regulation are also important. There are two places there that I particularly want to hone in on. One has to do with the procedures for developing, presenting, and negotiating indirect cost rates, and the other is the compliance supplement, which is, as I indicated, is an audit guide that independent auditors are required to use when they conduct your single audit. I like to refer to the compliance supplement, even though it's massive, as the Cliff's Notes of grants administration. Many of you will remember Cliff's Notes from your college days. It's what you're going to be tested on, and it's not just something that auditors should be paying attention to. Now, one thing that I think somebody in your organization needs to do is to get fully caffeinated and go through 2 CFR 200. On slide number 8, some of the key things that have been done. Unfortunately, OMB has renumbered a number of sections that are referred to in all kinds of grant agreements, sub-grant agreements, policy documents issued by federal agencies and pass-through entities. And just getting all that numbering squared away is going to take some time. The full integration of the changes will actually occur after January 1st, 2021. And that's when Title II will be recodified with all the changes that occurred in all the sections related to that regulation. The National Archives, which is responsible for regulations, revises them on a cyclical basis during the calendar year. And since there are 50 titles in the Code of Federal Regulations, each quarter they do about 12 of them. So titles 1 through 12 will be done in the first quarter of 2021. And, we'll have an integrated version of the regulation at that point. In the meantime, we'll be turning back and forth between the existing regulation and the changes. There are a couple of other things that have happened. One is, many of you will remember that during the implementation of 2 CFR 200, there were various iterations of frequently asked questions, which were issued by something called the CFR, the Council on Financial Assistance Reform. The CFR FAQs, as they're known, have been superseded by the changes that have come along that were issued on August 13th. So referring back to some of those things, the intent that OMB had was to fold those policies into the regulation itself. There are some key definitional changes. Those of you who've used the term catalog of federal domestic assistance are going to have to change the nomenclature. OMB has established something called the assistance listing, and that is essentially the same document with a different name. Another aspect of OMB's approach here was to redefine the period of performance, the budget period, and the concept of renewal. Now, the period of performance is considered to be a multi-year period of time made up of a number of budget periods. And I think what OMB was doing here was to try to create more decision points at which it could look at the performance of an awardee and decide whether to continue funding. So there may be some dastardly deeds associated with those changes. Another aspect that you need to understand, and this really comes along because of those memoranda that OMB issued back in the springtime related to flexibilities because of COVID-19, is the whole section on management of exceptions. OMB grants to itself the authority to issue what are known as class deviations. It can tell federal agencies to do something different than what's in the regulation, as long as it's not statutory. They can't violate statute, but they can create some variability in terms of the implementation of requirements. And that's exactly what happened in the spring with these so-called administrative flexibilities. This dealt with, in particular, the ability of organizations to use their current policies for paid time off and weather-related disruptions and things of that nature to continue to pay salaries and wages and fringe benefits during periods of shutdown. Now, it wasn't a question of requiring them to do so. It was allowing them to do so if they so chose to operate in that fashion. And those sorts of exceptions, I think, are ones that organizations need to understand can continue. Federal agencies themselves have the ability to do case-by-case exceptions to the regulation, and in so doing, they need to be convinced that that's warranted. Again, I think there are some opportunities there for organizations that get federal funds to engage with their federal agencies on the subject. Now, revisions to federal agency responsibilities on the next slide. These are the things that I suggested somebody in your organization needs to be aware of if you're getting direct federal money. A lot of the focus here is on enhanced program performance in design of federal programs and in solicitations for grant applications, and enhanced risk assessment. The idea that on the front end of an award, if a federal agency or pass-through entity does due diligence, the likelihood of something going in the ditch is reduced. It doesn't mean that it will be, but that's the sort of emphasis that OMB has created here. And as you can see from the slide, there's a database out there called FAPIS, the Federal Awardee Performance and Integrity Information System, which is a database that federal agencies can use to find out whether a particular organization has had a good history of implementation and integrity. And obviously, it can also find out when that's not been as effective. So this is something that I think some larger organizations are already part of that database, because if you get more than $10 million annually in federal funds, there's an entry there for you, and federal agencies can add to it. Now, moving over to the next slide, slide number 10, you might wonder what Section 889 and the McCain National Defense Authorization Act is all about. This gets us into something that relates to our foreign policy. Congress passed a statute that says that federal agencies, federal contractors, and federal grantees can no longer deal with certain companies based in China who provide telecommunications equipment and services. These companies are listed in 2 CFR 200 Part 216. And once again, the organizations that are most affected by this are the organizations that are performing overseas. But one of the things that it makes sense for you to do is to take a look at the equipment that you have and the service providers that you have to make sure that you're not dealing with any of these suspended companies that are dealt with in that section. Now, moving on to slide number 12, excuse me, slide number 11, some post-award issues that are also out there. President Trump issued a couple of executive orders that are being implemented in 2 CFR 200-301. And you may have seen manifestation of this already showing up because federal agencies have been required to modify their terms and conditions to capture prohibitions against restriction of free speech and religious liberty. So, as long as those executive orders are in place, there'll be some, I'm sure, controversy surrounding them. One of the things that OMB did was to modify the term payment when adding the word federal. And I think that that's a direct result of some of the input that NADO has provided related to not so much federal agency behavior on advance payment, but advance payments or lack thereof by pass-through entities. That regulatory citation is an important one, 2 CFR 200-305. 305B states specifically that non-federal entities, whether they are subrecipients or direct recipients, must be paid in advance, so long as they maintain an effective system of minimizing time elapsing between transfer of funds from the awarding agency and their disbursement. And the whole notion of cost reimbursement has been misunderstood for many years. Having a cost reimbursement agreement has to do with how we settle up on the agreement, not how it's financed. And unfortunately, some of the kinds of confrontations that have had to occur on that subject have not been particularly friendly. Now, moving over to slide number 12, let's talk about procurement. How you go about purchasing goods and services using federal funds. This is a place where OMB has updated the requirements in a couple of key places. The first of those is in what's known as the micro purchase requirement. The policy states that organizations like yours can establish a micro purchase dollar threshold based upon their internal controls and their assessment of risk, and that when they establish that threshold, they can make purchases below the threshold without going through competition. Now, it has been the case that this particular subject has been bantered about at the federal level for a number of years, and the migration of the threshold from 2014 to 2018 went from $3,000 to $3,500 to $10,000, and finally OMB decided to let recipients do this themselves. On the other hand, Congress stepped in and established a statutory provision that said that organizations could apply to their cognizant agency for indirect cost to raise the threshold as high as $50,000. Now, knowing what I know about governing bodies of area development districts and the like, that's going to be awfully rich for them. But the point I'm making is one of the steps that you need to do is to take a look at your purchasing procedures and see whether the thresholds you're using for micro purchases, for purchases that don't require any competition, are realistic in the current environment. Another aspect of the change has to do with the small purchase concept. And again, what I've tried to do in all these slides is to give you the regulatory citation so that when you go back and somebody says, well, where does it say that? You can pick that up. A small purchase, as far as the federal government's concerned, is a purchase where competition is sought and an organization must get a reasonable number of responses. There's no specific number that OMB identifies here, although certainly a lot of organizations have picked the number 3 in terms of getting responses to solicitations. But that being said, that the particular threshold that the federal government introduces there is up to what's known as the simplified acquisition threshold, which is a concept present in the federal government's purchasing procedures, and it involves up to $250,000. Again, I can't imagine that any regional organization in the development district environment is going to get anywhere near that number. But that being said, that, you know, looking again at your purchasing procedures and seeing what is the appropriate threshold for that type of purchasing is certainly an important step here. And OMB refers to both of these types of purchases as informal methods, to contrast it with competitive sealed bids and competitive proposals, which involve formal solicitations, identifications of specifications or scopes of work, that sort of thing, which is certainly appropriate the bigger and more complex the purchase is. So there's a couple places to take a look. Now, something else that's occurred, again because of an executive order that President Trump issued, is a new requirement related to domestic preference. Now, the language that I've quoted here on the slide is something that does have a certain amount of flexibility associated with it, but the notion of giving preference to domestic manufacturers or providers is certainly present. And regardless of who wins the election in a couple weeks, I think this is going to be a theme that will continue on. Those of you who were involved in the stimulus program during the Obama administration, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, will remember that there were similar provisions there, and they were, I think, to some degree successful. OMB has retained, however, the restriction that says you can't create a geographic preference within a state or a local jurisdiction. Because the money that you're spending came from everybody, you've got to cast a wide net on getting responses. Now, another major area that the regulations addressed is closeout. The next slide, and this has been prompted by a lot of controversy associated with federal agencies not closing out grant awards in a timely fashion. Now, what the consequence of that is when a grant isn't closed out, the obligation that the federal government made to the grantee is still open. And even if the recipient has closed out the grant itself, there's still money on the table. And Congress is interested in that money being brought back in to the federal government. So it has emphasized more timely closeouts as a result. Just to give you an example, under the GONE Act, the Grant Oversight and New Efficiency Act, federal agencies were required to report to Congress on their closeout activities. And just as an example, the U.S. Department of Transportation, when the reporting began, had 13,000 grants that had not been closed out in a timely fashion. They've reduced that backlog down to 6,500, and they're congratulating themselves on the subject. But the point is that there's a lot of pressure for the federal agencies to deal with this. Now, whenever there's pressure on the federal agencies, you know what happens. It rolls downhill. And so OMB has revised the deadlines for completion of closeout actions by recipients and subrecipients. And the interesting thing is that it's extended the time periods. Now you might say, what are they doing here? Well, what they're doing is giving more time for the closeout activities to take place so that it's more enforceable when those activities have not occurred. And so recipients will now have 120 days from the end of their performance periods to get in their final reports, to true up their awards, settle up with the federal agency, and so on. Subrecipients will have 90 days or earlier if it's agreed with the pass-through entity. And I have a feeling that some of the pass-through entities, in order for them to be able to meet their deadlines with the federal government, are going to be fairly rigorous about that. Now, that being said, federal agencies themselves don't have a firm deadline. They're supposed to make, and this is the word of the statute and the regulation, make significant efforts to close out awards within 1 year after the performance period is up. Now, the closeout actions haven't changed, but that section that's cited here, 200-344, clarifies the closeout actions that are necessary for this activity. One thing that OMB didn't do, and this may affect some of you, is they didn't address the impact of slow determination of final negotiated indirect cost rates on the ability of organizations to close their awards. Basically, if you haven't got your final indirect cost rate, you can't establish what your final claims are. So what a lot of organizations have had to do is do a closeout, and then when they get their final rates, have to reopen the award and settle up. And of course, settling up sometimes means paying the federal government back a certain amount of the money that was awarded. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that has occurred that has been, I think, a positive development is the attention OMB devoted to indirect cost. On slide 14, the first referral is to something known as the de minimis indirect cost rate. And this was an option that OMB introduced in 2 CFR 200 when it issued it back in 2014. The idea that an organization might not have to go through the process of submitting an indirect cost allocation plan and rate proposal, and could instead opt for an indirect cost rate that was based upon 10% of the modified total direct costs that it incurred. Now, initially, this was permitted only for organizations that had never had a federal negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, and that certainly didn't, certainly left out lots of regional organizations and maybe local governments who are members of your organizations. But what OMB did was to expand the group of entities that could have the de minimis rate, and that would include organizations that have had gaps in funding. In other words, they had a grant or maybe several grants at one time. They ceased to be a federal fund recipient for a period, and then they came back into the system again. And they were precluded from doing this under the original rules issued in 2014. Well, OMB has expanded the universe of entities that the de minimis rate can be applied to. Now, if it's used, it must be used consistently. So it's not something you can pick and choose what to do about. And there's a very important key clarification that OMB made. If an organization accepts the de minimis indirect cost rate, there's no need to prove costs met at least that level. It's the best way I can characterize the de minimis indirect cost rate is it's a little bit like getting a per diem for meals and incidental expenses when you travel at organizational expense. All you're getting is the per diem. You don't have to produce receipts, and you may, depending on what you do with your per diem, you may end up dipping into your own pocket, or you may end up saving a little money, but it's not worth following up and truing everything up. That's OMB's philosophy here related to indirect cost. They're trying to get away from the intense process of negotiation. And a number of you, I'm sure, have had to confront that because one of the things that was in the original 2 CFR 200 was a provision that said that if an organization received less than $35 million annually in federal funds, it was not required to submit its indirect cost plan unless its federal agency or its cognizant agency requested that they do so. And so this has left some organizations in a limbo in terms of getting a reliable response that can be used across the board to recover indirect cost. Now, once again, something that NADO members pursued aggressively and was certainly part of the NADO letter to OMB has to do with the next slide in our deck, pass-through entities and indirect cost. OMB was presented with a number of scenarios involving multiple pass-through entities, such as state agencies in the same state. Let's take one of those scenarios. let's say state agency A has an award with a lower tier organization like an RDO. And the RDO doesn't have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate because of the provision I just mentioned of them not being required to submit a plan to the federal government. So in order for them to recover indirect cost on that award from state agency A, they have to negotiate a rate using presumably the same data that they would use if they were submitting a federal submission. State agency A says, they review the rate, they're satisfied with it, they believe it's consistent with the underlying requirements of 2 CFR 200. They issue the rate, and the subrecipient organization is delighted. And then it goes over to state agency B and says, well, here's a rate we got from state agency A, and we're submitting that as part of our application for funds from your agency. And state agency B says, it's fine, they gave you a rate. We're not going to honor it because we didn't review it. And so rock and a hard place is another location that you become familiar with. Well, what OMB did in response to those kinds of scenarios was to explicitly state that acceptance of rates negotiated by other pass-through entities is prohibited. It's not required. They weren't prepared to go that far and force state agency B to have to accept state agency A's rate. But state agency B would have a certain amount of assurance that they were on good ground doing so if they so choose. Well, I think in order for that to work, there's some best practice considerations that can be introduced. One of them is when a subrecipient submits a rate to a pass-through entity, they certify the rate using the statement that's contained in 2 CFR 200-415. That's a very strong statement, and some of you will recognize it because it's the same statement that appears on the standard form 425 financial report that some of you have to submit directly to federal agencies. I certify to the best of my knowledge and belief that all data in this report is true, complete, and correct. And I understand that any false, fictitious, or fraudulent information may subject me to civil, criminal, or administrative penalties. Most people who sign something like that are going to make sure that what they're sending in is pretty accurate. If that's responded to by a pass-through entity issuing a federal-type rate agreement, similar to what the feds would issue if they were the cognizant agency for a particular organization, that would advance the process as well, particularly if that agreement had a statement by the pass-through entity saying, we use the procedures established in 2 CFR 200's appendices for arriving at the conclusion that this is a valid rate. And, ultimately, if those sorts of things are happening, I think that OMB's permissive approach toward acceptance of rates will have some real traction to it. And I certainly would urge, if you're in a situation where this sort of thing has to occur, that you consider engaging with the pass-through entity that you're dealing with, most cases state agencies, with those kind of best practices approaches. Now, the final thing that OMB did with respect to negotiated indirect cost rate agreements is that they have decided that they're going to post information about this on the internet. When they negotiated rates at the federal level have always been things that only federal agencies could look at. OMB, when they made the proposal to revise 2 CFR 200, introduced the idea that they wanted to post these things on the internet, and the recipient community broadly was very much opposed to it. So OMB backed off its original proposal and said it's still going to do it, but it's going to just limit the data elements in that posting to what the indirect cost rate is, the distribution base, which would be things like modified total direct cost, salaries, wages, and fringe benefits, or salaries and wages, and the rate type. So whether the rate is predetermined, it's provisional, or it's a fixed rate with carry forward. So that would be the kind of thing that the general public and presumably pass-through entities and other interested parties could look at for reliable information. There are a number of things that are not subject to federal disclosure under the Federal Freedom of Information Act, and this was one of the reasons why the recipient community was so up in arms about OMB's proposal. But ultimately, I think that the smart thing from a recipient and subrecipient standpoint is anything that you submit to the federal government that is going to become part of a federal database. If it's proprietary, label it as such. That doesn't mean it won't be disclosed, but it does mean that the federal agency has to consider whether to disclose it. And if there are, pieces of information that are problematic in terms of public disclosure, that would be the way to deal with it. Now, a couple of other things that OMB did in the post-award arena deals with our next slide, which is number 17. Cost principles and audit. Well, they just keep renumbering the sections without substantive change. But there are 3 changes to the cost principles, 2 of which you've already heard about. A new section in 200.414, which calls for public information on negotiated indirect cost rate agreements, and a new section on telecommunications costs. It's the first time that OMB has talked about that specifically. They say that telecommunications equipment and services are allowable cost, but then they carve out the prohibited items that deal with that set of Chinese companies that has proved to be problematic from a national security standpoint. Now, the other substantive change in the cost principles is one that's really key, and that's the second bullet on the slide. The general tests of allowability in section 200.403 kind of roll off your tongue because you've probably said it a number of times. The cost has to be necessary, it has to be reasonable, consistently treated, adequately documented. Well, OMB has added one. The cost must be incurred during the approved budget period. And the budget period, again, is an annual increment of time related to a particular federal obligation. Now, what this is going to entail is organizations accruing some expenditures during the approved budget period and then liquidating the expenditure after the budget period is over. In other words, paying the bill. But having to post the expense during the budget period is something that's never been explicitly required. And I believe it's a backdoor way to get organizations to adopt an accrual system of accounting. But in any case, that's one that is going to affect everybody. Now, a couple of other things related to audit activity. There's a clarification that pass-through entity responsibilities do not have to extend to subrecipient audit findings related to financial statements. What the responsibility of a pass-through entity is to resolve audit findings that relate to the funds they provided to a subrecipient. And arguably, there's enough on their plate to deal with that without getting to the broader issues of whether the financial statements as a whole are accurate. The other thing, and this is, again, something that in terms of what you need to do, there's been some adjustment to the deadlines for submission of single audit reports. The OMB memoranda that came out in the spring, March 19th actually, came out 12 days before the biggest cohort of single audit reports were due at the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. Those audit reports are due 9 months after a recipient's fiscal year. So if your fiscal year ended June 30, 2019, you had until March 31st of 2020 to get your audit report in. But, COVID-19 walked in at that point. So what OMB did in the memoranda that I mentioned is that they extended the deadline for submission of audit reports. So if your fiscal year ended June 30th of 2019, you had until September 30th, 2020 to get your audit report in. If you haven't done that, then you're late. But you had a 6-month extension. If your fiscal year ended September 30th, 2019, and you normally would get your audit report in by June 30th of 2020, you have until the end of this calendar year to get it in. So there's still time. And then finally, if you're on a calendar year fiscal year, if your fiscal year ended December 31st, 2019, normally you would have had to get your reports in 9 months out, or September 30th of this year, and you too have until the end of the calendar year to do so. Now, the important thing is, obviously, getting the audit report in at all is a critical step. But if your report isn't late based on those extended deadlines, you still can qualify as what's known as a low-risk auditee, meaning that if you have no significant internal control or compliance findings for 2 years in a row, you are subject to reduced audit sampling by your independent auditor. In other words, that's a good place to be. So look at OMB Memorandum 20-26. You can just Google it on the internet, and it'll pop up there, and it'll explain to you what the dynamics are related to that. Now, I mentioned the Cliff's Notes of Grants Administration. Our next slide, OMB's compliance supplement. 5 days after they rolled out the regulation, they rolled out the compliance supplement, but there's still some shoe to drop on this one. This compliance supplement is effective for audits of fiscal years beginning after June 30th of 2019. So the fiscal years that ended June 30 of this year, or September 30 of this year, or the end of the calendar year, are all subsumed into this supplement. OMB's first iteration was the main document, which is the annual update. And major issues that were included there have to do with identification of CARES Act funding on the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, the CFA, and the fact that there were differing requirements for COVID-19 and regular funding under the same catalog of federal domestic assistance numbers. So, for example, the requirements that came along for the Community Development Block Grant Program and some others were variable, and this is important because the auditor needs to hold your transactions to the requirements that were in effect at the time the transaction actually occurred. And so with some of these administrative flexibilities and the like, that dealing with that will not be the easiest thing out there. Organizations will be looking at situations where, for example, from July 1st, 2019 until the issuance of the OMB memoranda, they would be following one set of rules. From the time the OMB memoranda came out until they expired, they'd be following a different set of rules. And so that's the dilemma that the auditors are faced with. OMB has also indicated that it's going to issue a further addendum to the compliance supplement that deals exclusively with COVID-19 programs. They had promised to do that, quote unquote, in the fall, and we're well into the fall and it hasn't happened yet. The independent auditors are on the warpath about this because it is limiting the amount of time they have to conduct field work under obviously some very difficult circumstances. I have a feeling that that at some point OMB is going to have to do some further extending of time periods related to audit deadlines, but it hasn't happened yet. Now, there were two other sections of 2 CFR that were affected by the OMB issuances. Slide 19, 2 CFR 25 deals with registration on the system for award management and the issuance of a unique identifier. Now, this is the regulation that says that when you apply for federal funds, you've got to have a DUNS number, and when you deal with subrecipients member governments of yours, and so on, they have to have a DUNS number too. OMB's revised the regulation to establish that there are certain exemptions for individuals and for foreign organizations. They've broadened the definition of federal financial assistance to include loans. So if you have a revolving loan program and you've got recipients of those awards, they're going to have a DUNS number too, or as well. And there's a revised standard clause that is part of Appendix A of 2 CFR 25 that you should start seeing after November 12th. It picks up on those particular changes. Slide 20 deals with 2 CFR 170. That is the regulation that implements something called FFATA, the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act. That is the act that requires the federal government to have a searchable database of everybody who has federal funds either directly or at the next tier below. So it has to capture subrecipients. And the requirement here is that a pass-through entity has to report an obligation it makes to a subrecipient within a requisite period of time after the obligation is made. The original regulation established that reporting would occur when an obligation of $25,000 was made, and OMB has raised the threshold on that to $30,000, and there's a revised standard clause that will show up under those circumstances. You may be getting that clause from a pass-through entity, but you may be also imposing that clause on a subrecipient if you're the prime recipient of a federal award. Now, let me focus on what to expect here and what some of the steps are that I think make sense for an organization to respond to some of this complexity and detail. First off, are you a recipient or subrecipient? Because those statuses are being addressed in terms of specific regulatory steps. I think you're going to find that a lot of your awards are going to continue to adopt 2 CFR 200, 2 CFR 25, and 170 by reference, rather than with the explicit details of the text of the regulation. And that puts a premium on somebody within your organization knowing about these requirements. One of the things I run into fairly frequently is a situation in which a recipient or subrecipient is, I guess the proper word is, victimized because a federal awarding agency official or a pass-through entity official announces with great assurance, this is what's required. And nobody's in a position to challenge that assertion. I'm not suggesting you get into a hockey stick fight with everybody, but sometimes that statement is a refuge for scoundrels. Oh, the feds are requiring this. Well, I guess we have to do it, and everybody marches off into burden land as a result. So, getting a handle on what's out there related to these changes, I think, is important. You're also going to run into implementation of the closeout revisions, where a certain amount of pressure is going to continue there because significant amounts of federal funding have been left on the table for a long period of time. There's going to be some additional federal guidance related to the CARES Act oversight. And the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is the money that went straight to state governments and large local governments, has to be spent by December 31st of this year. So there's a lot of rush to judgment on how that's being done. And obviously, the more pressure to get the funds committed leads to a certain amount of potential cutting of corners and so on. And finally, the addendum to the OMB compliance supplement. Keep an eye out for that one, because that's going to be a place where there's going to be some specifics about some of the programs that you are wrestling with right now. What to do now? Drill down on the details once again. Address the new policy on incurrence of cost. Recognize that you've got some pressure there to assure that you've post expenditures within a requisite budget period. Review the policies on procurement of goods and services and reconsider the thresholds that you're using. And also fashion a policy on the domestic preference requirement that was introduced by President Trump's executive order. Review the policies on indirect cost recovery, in particular the requirements related to pass-through entity recognition of indirect costs of subrecipients, because of course many of your awards are classic arrangements where the money goes to a state agency and they in turn subgrant to you, and may have been taking a more draconian view of your recovery of indirect costs as a result. Adjust your closeout procedures to the new time frames and understand that. And finally, review OMB Memorandum 20-26 audit requirement with your independent auditor. Independent auditors are very much a stakeholder in all this, and they're trying to keep up with drinking from a fire hose on many of the requirements I've talked about. Now, the final item, take a longer term view. And here, I think this is a segue into the program that's going to immediately follow this one, that's being convened by Marielle Burgoyne from the NADO staff. It's very clear that NATO's viewpoints have been looked at and considered in the OMB processes that I've talked about. And continuing to talk to them and to engage others related to concerns that organizations have is critical. So re-engaging on the things that OMB said were out of scope, and slide number 4 has those listed out. Identify and document additional pain points. Experiences you've had with OMB's administrative flexibility and with the CARES Act funding, I think are things that elected officials and high-level appointed officials need to be aware of. Identify and document burden-related consequences. I can tell you that those kinds of horror stories are things that do resonate at the OMB level and at the federal agency level if they can be documented. And letting people know at NATO that these sorts of things are out there. The letter that was submitted in March picked up on numerous pieces of input from individual members of NATO who, took the trouble to say, here's what's going on in our state, and can something be done about it? And the example of OMB revising the rules to make sure that pass-through entity negotiated indirect cost rates can be honored by others was a significant step forward. So communicate on the record with the federal agencies and pass-through entities, and open channels of communication with the elected officials. Providing them with information about some of the problems that are being confronted. And I think, for example, a number of organizations in NATO have had difficulties related to recovery of costs for their facilities, where the awarding agencies are saying you can't recover cost on something that is considered fully depreciated. And unfortunately, OMB's policies make that an accurate statement. But the fact that it is doesn't mean that it's fair. And the idea that an organization has to give a free roof over their head to a federal program and only charge operation and maintenance expenses for their facility is a significant short-sheeting of what's going on. And that's the kind of stuff that gets the attention of the policymakers. So try to engage on this going forward in ways that will continue the effectiveness of the organization in fashioning future policies. So let me turn it back over to Trish, and we'll open it up for your questions that you may have submitted.
Okay, thank you so much, Bob. I see one written question at this point, And let me read it. It says, hello, will there be any continued opportunities to communicate concerns to OMB about 2 CFR 200, or at this point, is all of the guidance final?
Well, all the guidance that's been issued is final, but that doesn't mean that organizations aren't in a position to continue that dialogue. And what I would encourage NATO to do, and I know this is something that I've certainly discussed with the staff, is to continue to package information about the impact of these requirements on NATO members and to present that to them uninvited. Now you might say, well, is that appropriate? Well, we all have a right to petition the government for redress of grievances. I think that's constitutional. But if I want to point to some place where this is an effective approach, I would point to the colleges and universities. Most of the things that OMB did in the revisions to 2 CFR 200 tracked with suggestions that were made by the college and university sector that is well represented in Washington, and they don't wait around for another invitation. They are very willing to engage with OMB and with the federal agencies in a continued dialogue and presenting case after case of things that they think should change, and they're extremely effective. The other group that I would say is having as much of an impact on policy in this area is the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, because they are being viewed as the federal government's first line of defense against fraud, waste, and abuse in federal programs. And so their engagement on 2 CFR 200, on the compliance supplement, on the continued issues related to the addendum on the compliance supplement, all of those things are places where they're writing to OMB on a regular basis. That doesn't mean that they get everything that they want, but they are such a constant player that they're getting some of the things that they need. And so I think a proactive approach by NATO itself, but also by its members. I mean, one of the things that's going to happen, because of the election, is we're going to see a new scorecard in terms of who's in charge on Capitol Hill. I don't mean taking over the House or the Senate or whatever, but the whole committee structure will be reshuffled. There'll be new people on some committees, and looking at who's in your congressional delegation and who sits on committees like the House Committee on Government Reform or the Senate Committee on Federal Spending Oversight. Those are the places where these kinds of issues resonate, and providing them with detail about the impact on organizations within their state is, I think, where effectiveness shows up. One of the, I'm not talking out of school here. One of the things that presaged NATO's letter to OMB in March was engagement with the office of Senator Rob Portman from Ohio. And Senator Portman is the former director of the Office of Management and Budget during the George W. Bush administration. And so he's a key player. He's not running for re-election right now, and so he's going to be in the Senate for I'm not sure it's 2 or 4 more years. There's somebody who entertaining information of the type we're talking about, it would make sense, and that can be replicated in state delegation after state delegation. You just have to take a look at who's in a good position to help drive decision making on these subjects.
Great advice. Answered some of my questions as well. Thank you, Bob, once again for sharing your experience and your expertise with all of us in the COG world. We really appreciate your insight, and thank you so much for your efforts in helping us through this process. Now, finally, as a reminder, the closing plenary, Virtual Advocacy Strategies and Successes in the COVID-19 Era, will convene in this room at 3:15, and I hope you stay to learn from NADO staff and some of your peers about the many ways we can all continue to successfully advocate for our programs at the state and federal levels, even with all the challenges presented by the pandemic. Also, please be on the lookout for the conference evaluation, which will be emailed to you on Friday. Your feedback will be very helpful as NADO staff plan future events. Thanks again, Bob, for sharing your knowledge, and thank you all for listening in and attending this virtual event.